Last week we released Star Warrior, which is this dystopian themed piece with hints of Star Wars and science fiction thrown in. So when we started brainstorming ideas for the photography for this week, we really wanted to try to find something that had a lot of texture, that was practical, but also easily able to be changed and modified for each piece. After a lot of thinking and research, we ended up landing on picking up a few containers of this craft sand, which actually ended up being a really nice color that fits the piece well and really had that level of texture that we were looking for to complement these pieces. And after grabbing this big plexiglass tray that we already have, I basically started to just experiment with how many different ways I could pour the sand in, I could move it around to create different looks. This included making different mounds, moving the sand to create ruts for your eyes to follow towards the piece, a bunch of different variations. One of our team members even 3D printed me this custom rake with nails in it that I could use to put different lines and drawings into the sand. There was a lot more research and testing that went into these photos than it probably seems when you guys see them on your feed. The first setup I successfully landed on was for these photos. And while this design wasn't the most complicated, it really worked to create some nice shadows and texture against these pieces. I started by pouring the sand in a somewhat random order to try to create a varied surface of sand with different levels and small hills. I then turned my attention to the lighting, which I really tried to find a balance between harsh and soft to both help the piece present nice while at the same time creating nice harsh shadows to mimic sunlight across the sand. After everything was all set up, I got to taking the pictures, and I think they turned out really well, particularly this picture, which I actually picked up some sand and threw onto the piece as I took it, which really created this nice high wind dystopian sort of feeling. For the next set of photos, I actually took a piece of a Joby Gorilla Pod and used it to create these really nice and smooth circles in the sand. I kind of spun it around much like a clock to try to create really consistent lines, and then I set the piece directly in the center. For lighting, it was really similar to the first setup we did. I really wanted to lean into the harsh lighting because I really wanted to allow the ridges that were created by using that tripod piece to cast harsh shadows and really create that contrast between the light sand and the dark areas. For the last sand only shot, I did a really simple setup. I just took the whole container of sand and poured it into a single mound in the center, left the lighting the exact same that I had it, and pushed the piece directly into the center of the mound down so it formed almost this makeshift impact crater around the piece and created these nice smooth ridges. Really simple. Something fun I did with this set of photos in particular though is I took this burnt white glove that we had mounted on a 3D printed hand from a shoot we did a few months ago, and I used it as a prop to create this sense of a hand reaching for the piece and to cast these hand-like shadows across the artwork, which I think really added a level of humanity into these photos, really leaned extra hard into that dystopian world. Oh, and I also used this same exact setup to take all the pictures that you guys saw of every variation on the website, if it looks familiar. After finishing up the sand-only pieces, I wanted to experiment with some props. The first attempt being this setup, with the piece appearing to be perched on top of a rock sitting in the sand. To create this, I poured the sand into a mound and then took two halves of a 3D printed rock and hot glued them together to create one cohesive rock. These were perfect to use as they were already constructed to have a slot for the piece to sit into, so really all I had to focus on was gluing them together nicely and disguising the fact that they were two different halves and not a real one solid rock piece. So I took a bunch of leftover sand and poured it on top of the rock and around the rock to kind of hide those imperfections. And after setting up the camera on a tripod for a nice static setup, that was it. And I really like how this one turned out. Lastly, I wanted to go all out with creating textures, which is how I ended up with these photos. This was easily the most elaborate and time-intensive setup. I started with pouring sand into the tray, much like the other setups I had already previously done. But then I went on a hunt around the fabrication space of our studio and tried to find pieces of scrap metal or other materials that I could use to put in the scene and really create almost an environment around the piece. At the end of my search, I ended up finding these pieces of tubing, these pieces of 90-degree leftover metal, and this hunk of something that I still don't know what it is. I also ended up grabbing some broken mirror pieces and throwing them all together in the sand. This proved to be a little bit harder than I initially thought it would be. I actually had to take tape and tape some of these longer pieces of scrap metal to the ceiling, which took way longer than you see in the behind the scenes. For the lighting, once again, leaned into a really harsh look. I really wanted to act as if the light was the sun coming down on this dystopian surface, so I really wanted harsh shadows, nothing soft, nothing diffused. After dialing all that in, I went ahead and snapped a ton of different pictures, which I think turned out really fun. If I were to add anything to these photos, I would composite a background and change this black into a gradient of some sort. Regardless, I'm really happy with how these turned out. So that's the breakdown. That's the behind the scenes and inside look at all the photos that we posted this week, and even some that we didn't end up posting this week. It's really fun to come on here and show you guys an inside look at the process. If you have any pieces, you know how hard it is to take photos of them. So it's always a challenge, and it's always an interesting process getting all of these photos dialed in. Thank you for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed, and I will catch you next week with another full breakdown. Take care.